Now that we've seen that we can create a flexbox, we can set the flex direction. In this lesson, I want to dive deeper into probably the biggest topic of Flexbox, which is creating layout and how you create flexible layout. What is the automatic or default behavior of Flexbox, and what can you change to make it what you want it to be? One of the first things to differentiate when we're talking about the different properties to set is this property going to go onto the child, which is the flex item? So in this case, each of these items that are contained within the flexible container is a child, or is the property going onto the parent, so the container? And it's important when you're learning Flexbox to really differentiate between these two things, because as we saw earlier, if you set a property that's intended for the child on the parent selector, it's not going to work. So the first thing I want to mention is that, and this property is called order. As you can imagine, what it sets is the order of your child items. Normally, this is the color of the rainbow, and you might remember the acronym ROY, G, BIV, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Now, funnily enough, when I learned the rainbow, for some reason in my mind, blue and indigo were always the other way around. What if you wanted to rearrange these colors of the rainbow? Well, you would use the order property. By default, everything has an order of 0. So they're arranged by their order in the HTML. The red div is above the orange div, and this is where the order comes from. What if you wanted to change that? Well, you could set the order. For example, if I selected the green div, and I said, well, let's set its order property to 1. Well, immediately it's going to go right to the end of the Flexbox. It's going to be the one at the end. Now, you could change that to 1, or you could have it as 5 or 10 or 20, whatever it is. As long as there's nothing set between that number and any of these other ones, which are all defaulting to 0, then it's just going to look at which one's bigger, right? 10 is bigger than 0, so 10 is going to go here. But if this was 9, then obviously 10 is greater than 9, 9 is greater than 0. But say this was, 20, then the 20 is going to get moved over here. So this is just a really easy way of picking out a specific element that is a Flexbox item, and then setting the order property on it to be whichever it is you want to be to set up the order. So pretty simple so far. The next one I want to mention is something called the flex wrap property. And this is really useful when you run out of space on the horizontal. Here we've got a row-based Flexbox. The main axis is from left to right. New items gets added on here at the right. But what happens if you have too many items, or some of these items are a bit longer? Well, it's just going to be pushed to the end, and once we run out of space, it's not going to go on to the next line. This is the default behavior of Flexbox, and the flex wrap property is normally set to no wrap. Don't ask me why there is no hyphen between no and wrap, like a good CSS value should be, but this is just how it is. And every single time I look at that property, I always see the words now wrap, and I think about Snoop Dogg rapping to my Flexbox. But remember, no hyphen, that's just the default behavior. Let's say we have a new item and everything is set to no wrap, then it's just going to continue pushing until you can't collapse any of these items anymore and things get pushed off the page. Now you can change this property to wrap instead, but this is not a very responsive layout, because when you shrink the width of your window, then all the items that don't fit are going to be pushed off the screen and the user won't be able to see it. if you want this to actually continue on to the next line instead of being invisible, then you could change this property, flex wrap, to wrap instead. And what this will do is it'll move all the elements that don't have enough space to fit in its full minimum width onto the top line. It'll just go to the next line and continue wrapping. Now remember, this flex wrap is a property on the parent. So this is set onto the Flexbox container itself. And it tells how all of the children should behave, namely they should wrap around. Now, it's a really good idea to play around with some of these properties to see how they work, which is why I've created a demo website for you at appbrew.github.io/flex-layout. So if you go to this website, you'll see we've got our rainbow colors and we've got some selectors down here. We just learned about flex wrap, which can be changed on the container. And the container is this orange box that you see around the entire border here. If we turned this container into, say, flex wrap, then you can see what will happen is when I decrease the width of the screen, all of those child flex items go onto the next line, which is pretty neat. Now, there's also something called wrap reverse, and it means that things are wrapped, but it goes from the bottom right corner to the top left corner instead of the normal version, which is from the top left to the bottom right. It's sort of like an axis, I guess, because we're now in 2 dimensions when we're wrapping. Have a play around with that. And then once you're done, let's learn about another property. This one is called justify content. And again, it's set on the parent container. Justify content basically sets the distribution of our items along the main axis. This concept of main axis and cross axis is going to come back. But remember what we learned when we learned about the flex direction. When we have a row, the main axis is from left to right and the cross axis is from top to bottom. So here we have a row-based Flexbox. So that's how it's set up. And if it was a column-based setup, then the main and the cross axis would flip. In this particular example, if we set the justify content to flex start, then this is exactly what you're going to see. Everything is going to be bunched up to the left. And on the opposite end of that is flex end, where everything gets bunched up all to the end. And this is, of course, provided that when all the items are expanded to their maximum width, there is still space left for us to actually justify the content. If all the items have already taken up all this space, then this is not going to behave like this. Now, the next one is justify content center, which is a pretty easy way of centering items in CSS compared to all of the other ways that we can center using traditional CSS. This is a really almost like a godsend of a property. Very easy to horizontally center, or if you had the main axis going that way, you could vertically center as well. And then there's also different properties which allow you to have spacing between the different elements. And this is something that's used really commonly because when you're creating a website layout, you kind of want everything to use up the available space and create some gaps between each other to distribute. Coming back to our demo website on Flex Layout, then if we take a look at the justify content, you can see we've got flex start, flex end, and I want you to just play around with some of these different versions. So space between makes sure that the first and last items are stuck to the edges of the container, and then space around makes sure that this gap between the left and the right, the center, add up to the space between each of the items, and then there's space either evenly where each of the gaps are equal. So Flexbox does all of the maths and calculations for us in order to achieve the layout that we want. And if you play around with some of these different versions, then you can see what is it that you want to achieve and which value you'll need to set for justify content. The next property is called align items. And align items is a little bit different from justify items, even though some of the values might seem really similar. This is the position of the item. So remember, this is a row-based flexbox. So here is our main axis, and this is what we use justify content to set the distribution. Now, in this case, we've got align items, which actually sets the distribution along the cross axis. And again, this is a property that's set on our container. But if you notice here, our container is only taking up the height of our items. For align items to really work, we actually need to set the height of the container. So in this case, we're setting it to 70 VH, and VH is short for viewport height. It's basically the height of the window that you're viewing the page. If this was the window size, then this would be 100 VH. And then if we're setting it to, this is not quite 70, this is more like maybe 60, but this height is what we're setting when we set the height of our container. So once our container is a little bit bigger, then we actually have the ability to align our items. Align items flex start is going to make it all bunch up to the top. And then we've got flex end, which makes everything bunch up to the bottom. And similarly to justify content, we've got center, and we've also got some other stuff. To demonstrate align items, I want you to change the flex wrap back to no wrap if you've changed this. And then if you see flex start, flex end, center, baseline, or stretch, they all work pretty much as you would expect. Now, if wrap was enabled, then you're going to see that the behavior is not going to be quite what you expect. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later on when we talk about align content. But for now, keep the wrap set to no wrap and then play around with align items. Now, what if you wanted to align everything in the container to the center? So you use align items center, but then you wanted one particular item, for example, this one, to be right at the top. Well, it would need a different align value, right? In this case, what you can do is all of these properties that we've set over here are on the container, so on the parent. But you can reach into the actual item itself and set a property called align self. So this is saying, let's be an independent item and let's think for ourselves. If we set this property to start or end or whichever it is that you want, then it'll actually make this item separate from the groupthink and do its own thing. At this point, you might already be a little bit overwhelmed by all of the different options. You're thinking, oh, what if I don't remember all of these? Do I have to memorize everything? No, we are programmers. We don't memorize anything because we have the internet and the computer at our fingertips. A good resource I want to point you to is the CSS Flexbox cheat sheet from CSS Tricks. And I will link to it in the course resources for this lesson. So you can either download the entire poster or you can just look through it in the web page. Notice how they differentiate between properties for the parent and the properties for the children. When we look at something that we've talked about just now, for example, flex wrap, it tells you all the different possible options. So you wouldn't set all three, you would pick one. And it tells you what each of these values will do. Similarly, we've got our justify content. It shows you what each of them does and also describes what each of them does. And then align items. And then what we saw just now was a property for the children, which is the align self property. And you can see all of the different possible variations that you could use. Now, the final property I want to talk about today is the align content. And I said I would come back to this. Align content is similar to align items, but it only works when you have the flex wrap set to wrap. So when you've made your items wrap and then you want to specify how the content should align, then that's when you would set align content. If we applied align content to center and we made our flexbox wrap, then when the width of our window reduces, everything will bunch up together. If they need a second line, they'll go onto the second line, and then it's going to look at this align content value to see how it should be spaced on the screen. One of the things you might be wondering at this stage, well, what exactly is the difference between align items and align content? Because when everything is no wrap, when we set align content, it doesn't really do anything. But when we set our items to wrap and then there's not enough width to have everything on one line, that's when our align content starts working. So we can set it to center, we can set it to flex end, to flex start. Have a play around with the different properties and take a look at the cheat sheet here. Remember, you don't need to memorize anything as long as you know where to go and find help. So when you want to align something and you don't remember what justify content does, go over here, just read the different values and pick the one that you want. And I'm really big believer in the sort of just-in-time recap. So when you're learning stuff like you are now, I'm trying to tell you all the things that are possible. And then when you actually need to apply it for your own projects, you remember the fact that this is possible. And all you need to do is just to refresh yourself on how to do it precisely. And that way you don't have to memorize any of the things. Now, in order to complete this lesson, I want you to complete the Flexbox Froggy game. This is an interactive game, and it's a really, really brilliant concept created by Thomas Park, where you can apply your knowledge of everything that you've learned just now in order to move the frog to the lily pad. Head over to appri.github.io/flexboxfroggy, and I want you to go into the settings, and I want you to go ahead and select intermediate. Now, notice here there are also different languages if you need that. You can also change the colorblind mode to on or off, but I want you to complete the challenges in intermediate mode. So there's no directions, but remember you have the cheat sheet and you have what you've learned in this lesson. And the goal is to write the code that's going to move our frog onto the lily pad. So for example, in this case, we've got display flex. So we know that this is a default row-based flex box. If I want to move my frog from the start to the end, all I have to do is use justify content and set it to flex-end. And once I've done that, you can see my frog is on the lily pad and the next button becomes active. That's just a demo. The rest you're going to have to figure out yourself. If you get stuck, you can go back to the beginner difficulty where they're going to give you a lot more hints. But ideally, I want you to stay on intermediate with no directions. Do as a professional developer would to read the either MDN docs, or in this case, probably easier to just go to the cheat sheet and figure out what will help you. And maybe even use the demo page to help you figure out what it is you need in order to move your frogs. Go ahead and try and complete all of the different levels. And if you get stuck, you can always change the difficulty and you will probably be able to solve everything much more easily. Pause the video and give that a go now. And once you're done, head over to the next lesson where we're going to continue learning about how sizing works in Flexbox.